Conscient Podcast, episode 176. Multimedia artist, activist, organizer, and farmer, Annette, Hegel.
We need culture to shift behavior. Because everything is culture. But the mentality is that art is an adornment, and not actually a tactic. And I think art is a tactic.
I first met Annette while I was chair of the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency, or SCALE, and have since then gotten to know her as an artist here in Ottawa, on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. Annette's multi-disciplinary work emphasizes social critical art culture, with political themes at its center, addressing both local and meta-national conditions. Overall, her work raises issues within a civil society to challenge the isms and all their inhumane expressions. Art, climatism, anyone? Annette defines herself as a builder of capacity of the arts and cultural sector to respond in the climate emergency. And she's well placed to do this as organizational development and network lead of SCALE. So we talked about SCALE during our conversation and some of the challenges of mobilizing an arts sector that already has many challenges to face. And yet the climate emergency is a unique situation. I mentioned that many co-founders and mission circle members of SCALE have been featured on this podcast, including Judy Pearl, David Maggs, Kendra Fanconi, Tanya Kalmanovich, Ian Garrett, Kimberly Skye Richards, Sanita Fezich, Anthony Garofalo-Sauger, Tracy Friesen, Vivienne Gosselin, Robin Sokolowski, and Anjali Apadirai. Quite a cohort of art and climate activists. I enjoyed my conversation with Annette. We were in her studio at the back of her house, and we could hear and feel the rumbling of the Queensway Highway nearby. Her response to one of my questions in particular touched me.
In any time when there's a cultural upheaval, there has been the power of art not to only illustrate the situation that we're in, but also been able to kind of imagine a place where people could go. If it is, I don't know. I mean, Dada did that, after the First World War, kind of dismantling like the beast that brought this devastation, and then also coming in with a sense of imagination and joy to move forward and show people around them that there are other ways of being.
Conversations with artists and cultural workers are generally informal. But I will introduce you a little bit because I first met you only a couple of years ago when I was on the board of SCALE. That's the other organization I was involved with. And I was part of the hiring process. And I was very happy to see you come on board SCALE, and we'll talk about that a bit. But I'm also really interested in your work as an artist and as an activist over many years. And you've been talking to me about it, and I'm curious, to know more about and how those things interconnect, with the work, because I do the same. I have my personal practice, and then I have my professional work, but that's all sort of the same thing, right? Because they're all similar concerns. But anyway, why don't we start with just an introduction of your background and who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into some of your work and scale and all of that kind of thing. So
that
welcome.
sounds great. My name is Annette Hegel. I'm a queer settler artist. I live on unceded Algonquin territory in a city called Ottawa. I identify also as, what is it, a pinko cyclist. I still have that button. A urban farmer. I am a community activist and have been all my life. And, as you just said, Claude, there's a personal life and there's a professional life. And I think we're really lucky that we have come to an age or place in our lives where we can actually combine all these nerdy passions that we have and live a really holistic approach to our life. I think it's an incredible privilege, and I feel really lucky that I can do that.
And your background is in art. You're an artist.
I'm an art school dropout, yes. I went to the then humble Ontario College of Art in Toronto in the early 80s. I was in the very short-lived experimental arts department. That wasn't even in the main building. I was exiled out to an old cop shop up the street near College Street. But I was lucky to have, incredible teachers who really formed my approach to my work from a conceptual point of view, not so much from a visual arts discipline. So I use all the things that come my way. I learn all the techniques as much as I can. And, it's like, I'm always still often think about when I do some stuff that there's Liz Mager in front of me and saying, why the hell did you do that? So I know that I need to articulate these things at some point, not necessarily to an audience, often just to myself. But I find that it is important in my work that it is not just an exercise of navel gazing, not to be dismissive of self-exploration. But my work has always been really deeply embedded in the social activist art form. It's probably growing up in Germany and German heritage and growing up with artists' work of Georges Grosz around the house, responding to the Third Reich, things like that. Fun things like that.
Well, maybe tell me more about what you're working on now, because last time we met, I was in your studio here in Ottawa, and I saw some of the work and maquettes, and it looked like, eco art or something like that. I don't know how you define it, but tell me a bit more about the work you're working on now and what your intentions are, what are some of the issues that you're exploring?
Over the past it's now almost 10 years, I've worked in really close partnership and collaboration with Deborah Margot, who comes from sculpture. I come more from expertise in technology and media arts. And we've joined forces to create land art installations around the intersection of art, nature, and technology. And the work that we do, it really it's I think it's subtle. It aims to really, if I step back and it's like, why did you do this and how is this installation working? It's like it aims to develop empathy by the audience with and especially Deborah and I have worked around the lives and threats to pollinators over the past 5 years, 6 years, is to create environments where people immerse themselves in and big land art installations. They're always big installations, but it changes. The installations are big, so they change scale, so that when humans enter these installations, they actually get reduced in scale and become, are in the position of a bumblebee, basically, to experience that environment. So it's kind of building places of environments that generate empathy, that make people understand the impact of humans on kin other than human, and that we have all around us.
And I guess one would need to experience an installation like that, because it's obviously three-dimensional, and I don't know how interactive it is, but they're site-specific works, that kind of thing.
Yeah, some of the site facilities. Like we did haul an installation into City of Ottawa gallery. It was just before the pandemic. We had like 2,000 pounds of sedum that once we brought it in actually generated a lot of life, very much to the upset of the gallery manager, because all sorts of things were hatching in the in the sedum. Oh yeah, there were like butterflies and other things flying around the gallery. It was kind of awesome. It's tactile. There are sound elements. Sound gets triggered by movement. We also had a sense of smell thing happening there, because we were embedding some light elements in beeswax. So when the lights came on and the beeswax warmed up, you had the sense of the bees or honey around the space. We aligned the tech that we had was aligning the lighting in the gallery with the cycle of the moon, because that's how bees navigate. And the technology that we had, every little light had its own little server, and it was tied into the moon cycle, and it mimicked the quality of light of the moon at the time. So even though the gallery closed at night, we left all the windows open, which was one of the options in that gallery space in particular. You can close off the windows so people could come in from inside. So as the day came to an end, the moon started like rising within the gallery, kind of thing. So this cycle of the space was sound by day and quiet and moonlight by night. And it was there for 10 weeks. And it generated an incredible response from audience, with return visits at different times of day to experience a space in different times of day. So that was kind of that was a big deal. We're right now working on a big installation we just started last weekend. It's called Refuge for Kin Other Than Human, and it's going to be a kind of a big pile of wine waste, actually. Building a an environment. It's going to be it's quite big, actually. It's about 15 meters by 8 meters wide, 4 meters high. And it's going to be inaccessible to humans. However, we are embedding various kinds of microphones within that space that allow people through, audio fetch technology to listen what's going on inside this environment, this new ecology that will settle in that space, and to hear what's going on in there. But you will also hear With contact microphones, you will actually hear yourself walking around it. So you will hear the impact you have on those very small critters that are living inside this heap. We're building it out in Kinburn at the Feral Art Farm, which is a new initiative led by Christopher Payne and Jenna Murdoch-Smith.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could talk more about that, but I want to pivot now from art practice to art activism. And listeners of this podcast will hear me talk about scale quite a bit because Judy Pearl's been on the show, and David Maggs, and some of the founders, Kendra Fanconi, probably all of them, Robin Sokolowski, Tanya Kalmanovich, and many others.
Sanita and...
and Kim. I just had another conversation with Kim Richards last week in Vancouver, and but scale's important to us because it's a group of artists and art workers and activists who came together in 2021 and continue to this day to try to make the work of artists and cultural workers more engaged in the climate emergency and do all that coordination work. So I want to talk a bit about scale because you're leading it right now, and where is it at as an organization? We don't have to get too granular, but obviously people who don't know about it, it's easy to join. You just go on the website, that kind of thing. But so what is it today? There is an episode where Judy explains it quite a bit back then, but how do you see it today, and what do you think people should know about scale?
Scale is, at this point, about 1,000 people that have come together really organically and connected to find community within this kind of place of artists working in climate, arts organizations struggling with their role as institutions within that. Scale, the organism, is the connective tissue for all of us who are spread out across Turtle Island who are doing this kind of work. I find it interesting that when I talk to people in this community, they're already doing stuff. They're already dealing and thinking about climate. Some of them have come to it in a shorter term, newer term. Others have been dealing with this for a really long time and has had been also, included in much of their work that they've done over the many past years. But what it does, it is really connecting people in a way to allow us to articulate and find new ways of being. I think that's kind of what it is, and I think the most fruitful thing of scale. I mean, scale also provides tools and service and all that kind of thing. I mean, many other organizations do that, but I think the really special thing is scale being able to bring people together to talk about these very important specific issues. And that is led by community. So the burning questions, sometimes it's a burning question of the day, but sometimes it is really the kind of how can we change as artists in ourselves, in our lives, to model system change, for example, is one of the conversations. It is incredibly, I think it's incredibly inspiring to be in that place. I mean, artists are problem solvers. Like, every time we look at a blank canvas or a blank tape, or it's like we were supposed to put something on there, and we kind of got to figure out how to do that. So, in a world, I think, where we are looking at nobody has the answers, and in a world where approaches, rather than sitting back and waiting for the perfect solution, artists are the people who are really kind of heuristic. It's like, okay, let's fix this problem. Let's keep throwing stuff at it and see what sticks. And also be really transparent and and I think that's the other thing that artists do really well, is documenting everything, is to kind of keep track of what didn't work and then move on.
Well, certainly the role of art, I've been talking about it for about 4 years now, and I still haven't quite figured it out because it's elusive. There is no one role of art. If there was, it would probably be problematic because then it would be the role. But the role that artists play, as you say, are to shed light, to bring critical perspectives, a friend of mine, Azul Duque, calls it, the relationship between consolation and hope, because sometimes we need to be consoled. Sometimes we need to be entertained and pulled away from the madness of the world for a while to breathe a bit. And sometimes we need to enter it through the arts, through films and installations and whatever stories. How do you feel about the role of the arts? Scale is one organization that's trying to encourage that, but what do you think more generally about what artists could or should be doing in relation to something as complex as the climate emergency?
I think one thing that artists have done really well, not because we want to, but because of need, is to make do with little and continue doing the work that we do, without, lots of money. Basically, that's what it comes down to. Artists, there are very, very few artists that are rich. Most artists are not, and we know that from the statistics.
Well, not rich monetarily, but they lead pretty rich lives in terms of culture. But I understand what you mean.
Absolutely, but we also have, even in Scale's Mission Circle, we have artists who don't know where their rent comes from next month, right? So, and that is an existential stress that we it just it comes with the territory, but that is also a real lived experience of how to live a sustainable life, a life that's not built on consumerism, where the richness comes from the creative process and not from the consumption, and I think we could use a hell of a lot more of that in our world. And again, artists can model that, artists living it every single day.
And with your Scale hat on, you would know some of the barriers for artists to do more or be more. You talked about being. That's a nice way to describe being part of a community and being an artist. But what are some of the barriers for artists to become, and I don't say to create more climate art, because that's not necessarily, some want to do that, but to become more involved, to play a larger role in the climate emergency? What are some of the barriers to that for artists? Or are there barriers?
Well, there definitely are. The institutional barriers. There is, there's definitely censorship that is getting experienced. Artists are welcome in the realm of these conversations when we are, either like the orchestra that's playing on the Titanic, then we're welcome to come and do that, or with, the decoration on the table. So that is that's how the mainstream sees the role of art in it. That's how the people who are making policy and making decisions, they have not really come to a place of imagination, which is something that art offers, to include a cultural approach. Even though everybody says it, we know that we need culture to make the shift. We need culture to shift behavior. Because everything is culture. But the mentality is still that art is an adornment, and not actually a tactic. And I think art is a tactic.
Can you give an example of an artistic tactic?
There are some beautiful examples. I mean, there's a whole community of practice around an ecology of imagination that is artist led. It's a network across the world. It's a place where I go to when I'm tired and depressed and run out of imagination, and have a community of people who are doing that kind of work and really kind of successfully. There are pilots around the world. There's a pilot going on in the UK right now. Everything's always a pilot. This is how you find money for it. But where you generate places of imagination, where artists are making space in the community that is used. That no, let me rephrase this. Artists are leading projects of developing the muscle of imagination in community. And what has happened in places like Manchester or Glasgow is where the pilot of a storefront, this has kind of happened, that was money available during the pandemic. A lot of good things happened during the pandemic that we are kind of packing away again because we want to get back to normal. I'm putting normal in air quotes here. There, basically, empty storefront was rented, it was funded, artists were funded to bring community together to solve a community problem in a very hyper-local space, a very hyper-local issue. And what happened was that first used to be like a place of mediation, again, where art and culture is really good at mediating opposing views and kind of hardened fronts to kind of soften that up and start people having conversations. Then within that, community resolved the issues. If it was, childcare issues or garbage on the streets or like housing issues, even bigger issues coming up. Once the money ran out, the storefront was still there, and community just decided to maintain the space, like the public library, the public space for imagination, where now people kind of crowdsource. They go in and it's like, here's an issue, and they crowdsource solutions from it within the community. So those things are there, and they give me, we're talking about hope, even though I don't think hope is a tactic, but it's kind of nice to see that these things are unfolding, and that that there is drive and force and energy to move these things forward, regardless of if there's funding or no funding, regardless if it's a government policy or not a government policy. I see hyper-local initiatives by individuals who have a real strong sense that we need to change something, and if we're not trying it out, what have we got to lose, kind of thing.
Well, here in Ottawa, at the beginning of the French side of my season, I spoke with Sanita Fezic, who is a colleague of ours here in Ottawa, and talked about that local engagement through gardening, through cultural work, through storytelling, and imagining a better future. And it sounds, science fiction's been doing that forever. It's not always better, but there is this kind of cultural imagination. And I think that's a lot. It's maybe they're not necessarily concrete solutions, because if you're just focused on solutioning one problem, you might not see the big picture. And artists tend to not only see the picture, but to feel it. And then they translate those feelings into, like what you talked earlier, an empathetic work, or a work that draws beyond awareness into a kind of space of possibility, and also a reality check of what's really happening in the world. Like this weekend, I'm going to Montreal to speak at Choral Canada, and we're doing a panel on climate and choral music. And it's very interesting to see what artists are doing and commissioning works, and then my question to them is, what's next? What more can you do? And it's the same question I would ask at Scale or in any other network. What are we doing that needs to be amplified, that's working, that can be built upon? And what more can we do as artists? We don't have to become somebody else to further engage and contribute, and also receive support from society. You talk a lot about labor rights in your work throughout. People should be paid for their work. how can we set up situations where artists can, those who want to, engage further in, and it doesn't have to be the climate emergency, because there are many social justice issues that are connected to, that are the causes of the climate emergency, that whole picture. And you've given a lot of examples, and we'll talk again, because these things are unfolding. But how do you see, if you were just an artist in Canada doing their work, about an issue that's close to your heart, how can they take a step further to engage in some of the social issues that need their attention? Like, the world needs artists, and the artist also needs to be better connected to those issues and those who could be eventual collaborators. I'm just putting it out there.
Oh, I totally agree. I saw that happening when the gig economy collapsed during the pandemic, and we essentially gave people a universal basic income. At that time, I was the director of a media arts center. We had over 300 members who used the media arts center as a place of collaboration, but mainly to access resources that they otherwise could not afford. So they are at a certain economic level, living the gig economy, always really, a fragile economic existence. When they received the whopping $2,000 a month.
You're talking about the CERB.
I'm talking about the CERB, which all of a sudden was a guaranteed income. I saw so much art being made that hadn't been made before by so many of our members, because they didn't have to go and mop the floor at McDonald's. They didn't have to have these other incredibly time-consuming, low-paying jobs to pay their rent. All of a sudden, it freed up what they learned to do, what they studied to do, the profession that they acquired the skills to do. Some of the best work that I've seen in a long time was made in those 2 years, in 2020 and 2021. So I am a proponent, and in a wealthy country like Canada, to look at artists and support them in that way. I mean, the mean income of an artist in Ottawa is $19,000 a year. So $2,000 a month, which is that's $24,000 before tax. I mean, it is really, we were able to do it, and I think we can continue to do it. And I don't want to start talking about what the economic spin-offs are and the ROI, because that is the kind of thinking that brought us to the place where we're at in the world. Is that of growth that we cannot afford anymore.
Well, Clayton Windat, who I'm sure you know, spoke about this 3 years ago when I first talked to him during the pandemic. So I think you're right that there are pandemic conversations that need to continue, both in terms of the harm it's done, but also some of the ideas and possibilities that emerged in that crisis. And there will be other crises. There's wildfires in Canada right now that are tragic. People are being displaced. There's just yesterday I was telling you there was a report in the New York Times about the insurance industry in the U.S. and how it's not viable now with climate change. So the reality is starting to set in. And a lot of people only see it when it's in their front yard, and I understand that, but it is coming to your front yard, and we need to prepare, we need to adapt, we need to, as a society, also have more solidarity with those who are suffering the most, and Canada is good that way, you're right. But Canada has benefited from extractive resources, right? And so there's a kind of a two-edged sword there, and we need to figure out that how do we move forward. We've ironically become very wealthy on a very short term, but what do we do with the wealth we have now? How can we live differently? I was just in a conversation yesterday about artificial intelligence, which is full of potential, but also the carbon footprint alone is massive. So how do we balance these things out? We're going to stop soon, Annette, because we could go on and we will talk again. But did you want to say more about any of this?
I know that that artists, have done this work, for a really long time. There's like, it's not that we're inventing kind of that social activism that comes with through the expression of culture. I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of giants too, right? So, it's in any time when there's a cultural upheaval, there has been the power of art not to only illustrate the situation that we're in, but also been able to kind of imagine a place where people could go. If it is, like, I don't know. I mean, Dada did that, after the First World War, kind of dismantling like the beast that brought this devastation, and then also coming in with a sense of imagination and joy to move forward, and show people around them that there are other ways of being. Does it always stick? No, because the world goes in cycles and humans go in cycles. But it's a real ability. And I'm looking at, for example, I'm looking at Afrofuturism or Indigenous futurism. There's a real beautiful way of imagining futures that are not utopian. They're not rose-colored. They're also not dystopian, but they are looking at a world how it could be, coming out of the mess that we're in. We're not just abandoning the mess. We're not just going to another planet, but we're like, we got to go and deal with what we have and build on that and move forward. And I think, there's real power in that.
Well, I want to talk about a delicate topic, but you raised it a little bit earlier, that how art can be co-opted as well. If you think about the Nazi regime and how art was, well, I don't know if you call it art, but certainly...
well, there was sanctioned art and unsanctioned art, right? I mean, in any extreme dictatorial kind of or fascist governance model, culture is appropriated. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is appropriating culture right now by sponsoring every bloody museum around the world, right? So we're like, we're using art to greenwash, whitewash, all those kind of things. It's always been there. It's not like that art is inherently good, necessarily. Art can definitely be co-opted, and it is being co-opted. We're thinking about, I have conversations with young musicians who, and young artists who, any funding that is outside of government funding comes majority from bank foundations, and banks' investment in fossil fuels raises a real issue and a real problem for them. Can they afford to divest, so to speak, from their only other funder that is out there, that helps them to do their work? And this is kind of also where like a level of censorship or self-censorship comes in. It's like, will you call out RBC as one of the biggest fossil fuel funders when you get the emerging artist RBC grant kind of thing? So those are really, and those are discussions that are happening within Scale's community of, what are we going to do about this? How can we change this? We can all go, and I don't want to do a plug for Desjardins, but Desjardins is the only financial institution that is completely divested from fossil fuel, for example, right? So...
Well, there are ethical dilemmas there, and there are also ethical ways, or at least acknowledging the that you're biting the hand that, or the hand that feeds you is problematic, and it could be a short-term relationship, or it could be one where you're more upfront about your concerns, and yet you still take some of the money to do things, and I think there are ways of relating to them. You can completely disconnect and say, I don't do it, or if you do it in certain ways with certain objectives. I've seen that happen in the community, but at least there are conversations and there are positions taken. We are aware of the ethics and the risks of taking certain funds, but then there's a risk of not doing anything at all. So it's like how do you thread that?
Well, I mean, that is really, sometimes you got to be pragmatic and realistic, and you got to get stuff done. It's the age-old question: is, are we changing the system from within or without? And I believe it needs the whole spectrum. I really, really do. I think, for example, the anti-nuclear movement in Europe needed everything. It needed the people shutting down the highways as much as the people, starting the Green Party and working on policy and political level and everything in between. Consumers boycotting, also a tactic. So I don't think any one thing by itself will force system change. I think it takes a whole spectrum of tactics to achieve that. But when you look at it, that when it all comes together, those shifts are really kind of fundamental and monumental, and they stick around. They're not quickly undone.
Let's end with what you're reading or viewing or experiencing now. Do you have any recommendations for our listeners of things that they might want to read or listen to that have had an impact on you?
One of the things, one of my little Bibles here is Lucy Neal's Playing for Time.
Okay.
Lucy Neal, who has been a artist, community animator, activist for decades. Just reissued her book Playing for Time, which is like, for artists, it's like, play like there's no tomorrow, so you got to get it done. And it's a real, it's embedded in the arts community with an artist approach. It's awesome. It's an awesome book. The second edition came out. Like the first one, I think the first one she put out over 10 years ago, it sold out in no time, and then revised it and put it back out again. Raw Materials is a podcast that I often listen to. It's San Francisco MoMA, who hands over a season to a podcaster in residence. And I think the current season is on arts and disability arts. And, it always touches on, climate is touched by everything. Everything touches climate. So all these are really, really relevant, very contemporary art approaches and artists. And then the Dark Matter Lab in London, who does this incredible work, instigates incredible work, with the understanding that change is slow and you need to look at the long term. They're running a pilot right now in Sweden, which is so awesome. It is the universal nutrition basic income, where you go into grocery stores that are participating. There is the local grown apple that costs nothing, and the imported apple from France that costs whatever an apple costs. So there is a way of incorporating food security, but also food insecurity, and giving people the opportunity to get nutritious food for free.
Well, Indy Johar, who leads Dark Matters Labs, was part of the conversation we had with the Transition and Innovation Group, and I think it's episode 163, and he talked about how arts have been instrumentalized and need to be, freed up from containment, if I even use those words, but that kind of idea. So I really appreciate those kinds of think tanks and strategic long-term, and we have equivalents here in Canada, people working on and it's sort of in the shadows sometimes, and maybe they need to come out of the shadows and be listened to and dialogued with and maybe challenged a bit as well, but we need those kind of so that's why I'm so happy that you're leading Scale. Now, just so people know, sectoral climate arts leadership for the emergency, right?
Yeah.
En français, c'est le SAUT. And that organization can be a catalyst and a place for people to dialogue, but also to know each other. There's a digital tool that I've registered and people can use, and that can be useful regionally to see who's doing something in here in Ottawa or Montreal or wherever people are living, but also to have that national dialogue. There's monthly drop-in conversation sessions. I'm sure there'll be other things. You're going to do some traveling soon, so people should just register to get onto the new case.
Absolutely.
And then they know what's going on, and it doesn't, and then from there, whatever excites them, and I think there's some really exciting things happening in the Scale world.
It's a way for people to find each other, and collaborate, and that is really Scale facilitates that. So we built this tool where everybody can meet each other, and we also then know where people are, and then we can say, hey, so-and-so over there is doing this really cool thing that you would be interested in. And those connections have happened, in the year that I've been doing this now, even with our little resources, because there is a real desire out there. And it's also matching people up who are in science with artists. There are educators, there are people who are working in urban planning and economic development that are in the Scale network, and they're connected. And that's where the connection between art and other sectors are happening organically. And there's people who know that this is important. And it's really beautifully pollinating activity that does boat change.
It brings us
back to my bees.
I think we'll leave it on that. Leave it with laughter like we began. Thank you so much, Annette.
Thank you, Claude.